Hello, everyone. Welcome to NGA's webinar. I'm your host, Jake Barn, with NGA's Center for Best Practices. Thank you all for joining us today to discuss the impacts of COVID-19 on transportation operations and revenue, and really dive into how states, transportation agencies, and transportation systems are responding both in the immediate effects of this pandemic, as well as beginning the planning process for the immediate and long-term implications of what we are seeing. We are joined today by two fantastic experts, Darnell Grisby, the Director of Policy Development and Research at American Public Transportation Association, and Susan Howard, the Program Director for Transportation Finance and the Director of the BAT Institute at Ashe, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. We will be able to take questions today. There's a Q&A box in Zoom. If you're not familiar, it should be at the bottom of your screen. You can type questions in there, or you can email them to me directly at jvarn, that's V as in Victor, ARN, at nga.org, and we'll get to those after the presentations. So Darnell, you're up first. I've unmuted you, and Dave should be giving you control of the PowerPoint as we speak. When you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
All right.
If it's not advancing on your end, you can just go ahead and say next slide, and Dave can advance it for you.
Okay, that sounds good. So next slide. All right, so my name is Darnell Grisby. As you just heard, I'm Director of Policy Development and Research for ACTA. ACTA is an organization of 1,500 member organizations. This includes both the public sector and the private sector. Public sector would be such as our transit agencies, they're a public sector. We also have private sector members, which encompass engineering firms, planning firms, firms that generally serve transit agencies in their needs. So today I'll talk about both the public sector, those agencies, but also the impact of the current crisis on our private sector membership as well. Next slide. So I'm going to do that just by talking about some of the very immediate impacts. So we went to the field and polled our members over the last week to look at some of the very initial impacts of the current crisis on operations and revenue. So what I'm going to give you is a snapshot in time, and that could very well have changed since the survey closed yesterday. But I just want to give you that heads up that this is new and fresh information looking at the impact of the overall industry. Next slide. So this slide here is looking at some of the actions that our agencies, our public transit agencies, are taking in response to the COVID crisis. This includes increased cleaning, purchasing extra supplies, providing employees with information and guidance, and deploying messages to ridership, to our riders, just so they know what's going on with the system. Next slide. Most of our agencies, regardless of size, are experiencing major decreases in ridership, which I'll talk more about later in terms of the impact on the fiscal condition and what some of the prognosis is going forward. But you can see that regardless of size, whether it's large, medium, or smaller agencies, everyone is feeling the pain at this point when it comes to ridership. Next slide. Furthermore, oftentimes in association with this decrease in ridership, or because of protective measures to ensure the safety of our operators and other employees, we've been reducing service around the country. As you can see, the vast majority of different size agencies all over the nation have reported that they plan on cutting service, and many of them already have. Next slide. So many of our agencies, the vast majority, are part of the fabric of their community, which means They're a critical part of the response to the current health crisis, and they've been in constant contact with health agencies locally and federally and on the state level to ensure that the proper information flow exists and we can actually be part of the frontline defense against the virus. Next slide. So what we've seen is, according to the polling that we've gotten back, is a dramatic reduction in sales tax revenue. We are predicting a 75% reduction in sales tax revenue between March and September, with an additional 40% decline from September through December. So we're looking at dramatic decreases in sales tax revenue across the board. Next slide. In addition, we've seen a dramatic fall in fare box revenue, which would be the fares that our riders pay. Of course, if you're seeing a decrease in ridership, you're getting less revenue when it comes to fare box recovery. Next slide. So we're doing a variety of things to make sure we protect our workforce, because the service has to go on in many places, because first responders and others that are critical in terms of maintaining the supply network of the country, whether it be for deliveries of food or goods, a lot of those workers are dependent upon public transportation. So we play a critical role in maintaining that fabric of the community to ensure that those workers can get to their critical jobs. So what we're doing is protecting both them and our workforce with additional cleanings, which can be very expensive, and the cost of that has been rising for our agencies around the country. We're doing rear door boarding and fare-free service, which means that the riders oftentimes will not have to interact or get close to the drivers. Additional protective element for the drivers to make sure they're safe. Some of our agencies are pursuing the accruing personal protective equipment, also known as PPE, which is, of course, in short supply around the country. And we are doing entrance and station closures. So if you have transit stations, rail stations, oftentimes we're closing entrances or closing entire stations to ensure that our frontline workforce can have reduced likelihood of getting impacted by the virus. Next slide. So we also did a poll of our business members, and our business members are various sizes. They're large or small, in between. Many of them are DBEs. So this poll is really meant to get at the current situation for our business membership. We've seen some small percentage close permanently. We've seen a large percentage, 11%, have suspended operations temporarily. And the key thing about this question is we're not asking in this particular question whether or not your workforce is working from home, is whether or not you've actually had to suspend operations. And about 11% have had to because of the impact of this crisis. The vast majority are still in operation, fortunately. Next slide. So has COVID brought additional cost to your business operations? The vast majority say yes. And a lot of this has to do with cleaning and other things to make sure that workers and customers are safe. Next slide. So here's a critical question. Has your company experienced issues with its supply chain in the last month? 43% say yes, and of those that have said yes, one of the common refrains we saw in the survey was issues with supplies from China, which they had the crisis early on and impacted their ability to fulfill their orders to our members, our business members. So that's beginning to trickle down through the system. Next slide. Have you had upcoming orders or business canceled in the last month due to COVID? About 45% have said yes. So once again, in addition to supply chain issues, as I just noted, we're also seeing the cancellation of business that was expected. Next slide. So having gone through some of the intermediate and short-term issues we're facing, I'm going to briefly go through some of the longer-term policy implications of what we're facing, which are enormous. Fortunately, there's also a lot of learning that can happen from this that can improve operations going forward and make things more efficient. Next slide. So one thing we learned from the last recession, the one that began in 2008 and ended in 2009, 2010, was that it took 5 years for service cuts to be restored from those cuts that were made during the recession. So we know that reductions in service take a long time to be recovered. That has an impact on ridership going forward, particularly when you have new entrants into the marketplace, such as transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft. If your service has been reduced, you might be a little bit less convenient for the customer. That creates issues. If there's changes in gas prices, such as reduction in gas prices, all of this can have downward pressure on ridership, which can actually move states and localities away from their goals for climate change reduction. Next slide. One of the major issues we saw in the last recession, and including in this upcoming one, is the fact that sales tax revenue is a linchpin for local transit funding. However, it's one of the most volatile sources of revenue possible. And there are local laws and state laws that sometimes will inhibit revenue diversification. So we are fit into some of the most recession impacted revenue sources, which means you oftentimes will have a big reduction in funding, and that will impact your service, which will impact your ridership, and it's a knock-on effect. Next slide. So a couple of things that have come out of this, and this is a very short list, just things that I've noticed going forward here. Before this crisis, there was a lot of talk about fare-free transit. There's a lot of upside in that because it actually can, along with all-door boarding, speed up operations, which actually will reduce costs and actually make the service more efficient. So a lot of locations around the country are experimenting with rear door boarding and fare-free transit because of the crisis to protect their workers. But at the same time, they're getting to learn lessons about how to actually employ that in the future. So this is one of those situations where the crisis might create some innovation going forward for our membership. Next slide. So just to summarize, we've seen increased communications with and efforts to protect the public and our employees. There are learnings that are occurring from that that can be deployed in the future. We've seen big declines in ridership and farebox revenue and sales tax revenue reported in the survey. All of these can have an impact going forward. However, we do have good news from the federal government. Some of the support we're getting will mitigate some of those impacts, such as the $25 billion program that we just got passed yesterday, I guess today in the House. $25 billion, which includes $22.7 billion for large and small urban areas, plus $2.2 billion for rural areas. So the combination of that support, what we've learned from the last recession, what we're learning from this current recession and crisis, can actually improve how we operate going forward. However, that support is critical, and there may be a need for additional support going forward. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Darnell. Just as a reminder to everyone, feel free to submit questions to either Darnell or Susan, or just on the general topic as a whole using the Q&A feature on Zoom. As Dave passes over control to Susan's, I will go ahead and introduce her as well. Susan Howard, again, is the Director of Financing at Ashe and the Director of the Baddock Institute. And Susan, I will go ahead and unmute your mic and mute Darnell's. Great. Take it away, Susan.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this webinar today. As was mentioned, I'm from Ashe. I'll tell you a little bit more about us. Most of you are probably familiar with Ashe. But then I'll talk a little bit about some of the state DOT responses to COVID-19 across a few different areas, and then look at the transportation revenue impacts that we anticipate seeing, and some of what history can tell us, and what we might look for going forward in terms of how all this may affect both state and federal revenues for transportation. So Ashe is a nonprofit association that represents the 50 state DOTs plus District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. We also have associate members from federal, state, and local agencies. We are a multimodal organization, and we focus on not just on highways, but aviation, rail, transit, water, and active transportation. Sorry. Okay. Oh, wait, let me go back. Sorry about that. I think I'm going, I'm so sorry. I think I'm going forward when I want to go back.
That's okay. So you can just use the arrow keys
Okay.
On the left. You can go back some slides, or Dave can help you out.
Okay, when I'm pressing it, it's just going. Okay, so sorry, y'all. This is the first time I've used Zoom. Okay, that looks right. That looks like where we should be. Many apologies. So on the operations side, first and foremost, safety has been the priority for state DOTs. We're trying to focus as much as we can on continuing to provide service while still balancing the safety of our employees as well as the contractors that we work with. Like most everyone else who has an office job in the country, most state DOT employees that aren't out in the field are teleworking. And so we're going to first sort of talk about some of that operations side of things. We'll talk about logistics, particularly when it comes to freight goods movement, the role of communications, and then how state DOTs are working with other state partners and governors on emergency response. So when it comes to operations, one of the main areas of focus has been keeping rest areas open. That has been, of course, a concern for mostly as it relates to goods movement and truckers who need safe places to park and rest, use facilities. Most of the rest areas in the country are state operated and state run. Often they are contract staff who are staffing the operations. And so some of that has scaled back in some states in an attempt to keep those employees safely distanced from other people for health concerns. But at this point, all the rest areas across the country that are state run are open, and they may have some limited facilities, but we're trying to keep those open to be able to provide that kind of respite in place to facilitate the movement of goods across the country that are necessary. When it comes to construction sites, we have been, doing our very best to keep construction work ongoing. I'm aware of 2 states as of today that have suspended construction work due to safety concerns. It was just becoming more and more difficult to assure that workers were maintaining the distance recommended by the CDC. Those states are Pennsylvania and Washington. So some things there may have been modifications made. There have been, changes to staffing levels, changing to the shifts that people are working to be able to meet those CDC guidelines. But otherwise, we're working with the contracting community to try to ensure that safety measures are being adhered to and that critical infrastructure projects can be continued. For many, there's a safety component to that. The work needs to be completed in order to make the facility safe. Overall, we're trying as much as we can to keep things on pace when it comes to the projects that are underway. Things like transit and rail stations mentioned earlier, these are some of the public spaces that state DOTs are responsible for. So we're working to keep them clean and keep the staff and the public that are using them safe. When it comes to toll facilities and toll plazas, most states that have toll facilities have suspended cash payments and have shut down the toll booths themselves, which really lends to the use of electronic mechanisms for toll collection only. And again, that's in an attempt to stop that person-to-person interaction and exchange of cash at the toll facilities themselves. So that's another area where we're seeing some modifications of our current operations in an attempt to treat this with the most serious concerns we can. When it comes to logistics, again, this has mostly been focused on freight movement and again, the movement of essential goods. Certainly, we're all aware of how much we depend on our supply chain to give us, groceries in our grocery aisles. But most primarily, of course, the need is to be able to move emergency supplies and medical equipment quickly and efficiently. So when a state emergency declaration is made, there's an allowance for an increase in truck weight limits for emergency supplies. So that's been going on across the country over the last week and a half, where the permitting process is being modified to allow for oversized, overweight vehicles. Same applies for hours of service requirements. As you know, there are federal requirements that dictate how long freight truck drivers can be on the road and when they have to take breaks. And so some of that in the context of a declared emergency can be modified. So again, those are things that are happening state by state. There is some desire to have some more federal, federal guidance in place on some of that. And so that's something that we have been working on through the legislative movement of the stimulus bill and other vehicles to try to address that so that it's not just a state by state patchwork sort of approach. Again, as you know, cabinet level agencies, state DOTs are closely involved in implementing state emergency plans. A few examples on how state DOTs can be helpful in that have come up are particularly assisting with mobility needs around some of the critical infrastructure when it comes to testing sites, when it comes to hospitals and medical facilities. We're really trying to assist other state agencies that are involved in the emergency response with their mobility needs and their infrastructure needs. So as different challenges arise, whether it be with state homeland security or state security, public safety offices and health departments, to be able to use the transportation network in a way that it can assist in their work. Another area is when it comes to traffic data and counts, particularly in areas where there is a stay-at-home order or directive from a governor. We obviously, as state DOTs, have the ability to kind of be able to monitor through our systems how many cars are on the road at a given time and what traffic, where traffic is high, where it is low, and some of that kind of information has been helpful feeding into governor's offices as they look at different steps that need to be taken in terms of keeping everyone safe and at home. One thing state DOTs are very known for are changeable message signs, this is an example of one from California. You've probably seen them frequently on the road. They usually communicate things like, upcoming traffic stop or how many minutes it's going to take you to get from like where I live in Northern Virginia to Washington, D.C. But right now, a lot of states are being able to change those to project communication to the public about COVID-19 and their responses. As we've seen over the last week and a half, the steps that state governors are taking is evolving day to day, and information needs to be gotten out there. So this is one role that state DOTs can play in terms of getting the message out to the public about the latest on what steps should be taken to keep folks safe. I did want to spend a little bit of time on the revenue side of things, and I apologize if this is elementary type stuff, but I wanted to at least provide a framework for what we're talking about when we talk about both federal and state revenue for transportation. So as you probably all know, we have a highway trust fund that is funded through user fees as well as truck-related taxes. Our federal highway user taxes, the gasoline tax is 18.4 cents a gallon. The diesel is 24.4 cents a gallon. The vast majority of revenue that goes into the trust fund is from that 18.4 cents a gallon gasoline tax. And, that's obviously going to be affected by the amount of gasoline that people are purchasing. The truck-related taxes are kind of a combination of various fees that the freight industry uses. And again, those are also, sources that are impacted by changes in the economy, changes to behavior, as well as changes to what kinds of freight movement and volume of freight traffic that we see on the highways. There are also many state revenue sources for transportation. This is kind of from the most frequently used on down, and these really vary widely across states, but all states have their own state fuel tax at the pump. Most states rely on vehicle registration fees, license fees, and title fees. There's vehicle and truck weight fees in a number of states, as well as variable rate gas taxes, sales taxes on fuel, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole laundry list and a whole, and a lot of diversity in terms of how each state funds their transportation network. These two, of course, are going to be affected by changes in the economy, on decisions that people make on the purchase of a new vehicle, on how much they're driving, all of these different factors. And states are, there's a wide variety of reliance on federal sources versus state sources as well. Some states are heavily dependent upon their state revenue, and the federal revenue plays a smaller role. And then there are other states where, because of lower population, they might have a much more heavier reliance on the federal side. So they both come together to create, the pot of money that states are using to apply to transportation projects in their state. Where this really becomes an issue of interest when it comes to COVID-19 is what COVID-19 is going to do to vehicle miles traveled across the United States. This graph shows since 1981 what the VMT has looked like in our country. And you can see beginning in 2007, a pretty dramatic dip down in the recession that we experienced in the 2007-2009 timeframe. In fact, where VMT was in November of 2007, it didn't recover until March of 2013. So there was a very long tail to that recession in terms of how travel was impacted. We've already seen some preliminary estimates from states about what they expect with COVID-19. Some of us are, some of the sort of anecdotal information so far is saying that traffic volumes seem to be down already about 30%. We'll know more in the coming weeks about the data and what the impact of this economic really shutdown will be long-term. Again, all this are sort of preliminary estimates, but from looking back at some of the lessons learned from the last recession that we had, means most states are estimating probably somewhere around a 30% reduction in revenue. And again, a lot of that is based on fuel taxes. Since there's much less driving going on, much less gasoline being purchased, that translates to a significant drop in the revenue that states are able to apply to their transportation projects. So that's kind of where we are now. Again, I think it may, we'll get more and better data in the coming weeks. For right now, I think we're looking at something around a 30% reduction. And again, the question I think that we're all thinking and wondering is how long that may last. And I imagine that it will last a very long time. So states are going to have to make some decisions in terms of what projects they can continue to fund with the resources that they have, and what kind of federal assistance might be needed in the future. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for that great presentation. Darnell, I'm going to unmute you as well. And once again, for everyone, feel free to submit questions through the Q&A feature through Zoom, and we'll go ahead and field those. I'll kick it off, though, kind of talking a little bit about the news of the day with the new stimulus to both of you. Darnell, as you mentioned, there's a $25 billion portion that's dedicated to transit systems. Do you have a sense of how long or how sufficient that number is, how long that $25 billion will last, given the vast reductions in fare collection that transit systems are facing?
Yes. Well, we know this is an uncharted territory for all of us. And $25 billion is definitely something that is widely appreciated. Want to congratulate and thank both House and Senate leadership for their work, as well as the President. It's going to be very helpful. In terms of answering your question, I think it's early to tell. We'll see what the duration and depth of this recession is and how it impacts operations and what it does to revenue. As I said, we do have projections, but those projections could be proven to be too rosy. We'll see. So it's hard to really know if it's going to be enough, but it's definitely a great start, and we are very appreciative.
Absolutely. Susan, similarly, there's a proportion of the stimulus that goes directly to state budgets, but doesn't necessarily have a specific percentage or amount that would go towards state transportation agencies. You mentioned that there was a rough estimate of maybe a 30% decline in revenue, largely from declines in gas tax receipts. One question we've gotten in already is, what is that? Is that 30% based upon 2020 estimates? So 30% reduction off of what was projected for this year, or is it based off of last year's receipts? And then overall, do you have a sense of how that $150 billion that was in the stimulus, how much transportation agencies specifically may need, knowing that obviously it's dependent on each state and other revenue and budgetary considerations?
Sure. Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. Most of the projections that we're seeing are based on last year receipts. Most states do very detailed revenue forecasting and try to anticipate the out years in terms of what revenue might be expected. But the estimates that we've gotten, I think, are largely based on where things were in 2019. And I think that's probably the most accurate sort of benchmark to use. When it comes to the need for additional revenue, I think that preliminarily, ACTA, and again, this was in the very early stages, I think we're kind of conservative in our estimate of what the impact would be and put it more around 10%. And that extrapolated out was about $16.7 billion. And that was really to get states through the rest of this fiscal year and then fiscal year 2021. Again, that kind of estimate was based on the amount of revenue states spent on transportation in fiscal year 2019. So we're if you looked at that, and if we look at this 30% number, that's getting closer to the 45 or 48, somewhere in their range, billion. So a significant amount of money. I don't know yet with this money that the states have gotten for the stimulus. I think there's going to be a lot of really important things that states need to do immediately related to healthcare, related to emergency response and recovery. So I haven't heard anything definitive yet in terms of how the transportation functions in a state may benefit from any of that revenue coming through the stimulus bill. Certainly, I think there are going to be pressing needs that are immediate and that will, need to be addressed. So I wouldn't want to say definitively that a number that we would think would be necessary from that pot of money is certainly there's like a lot of different considerations that have to go into where that funding goes immediately.
Absolutely, makes a lot of sense. One other question that just came in for Darnell. Which states or systems were already trialing free transit experiments prior to the coronavirus? I know that DC's circulator, for instance, earlier this year went free. I don't know if you had any other examples that came to mind.
They're mostly smaller agencies around the country. And one of the reasons why you usually see that in smaller agencies is because the cost of collecting the revenue, the fare box revenue can be rather high. And then the question becomes, what is the delta between what you collect and the cost of collecting it? So oftentimes you'll see smaller agencies do it. We have seen some larger systems be interested in doing it, and one that comes to mind for me, and of course they're in the very early conversations around this, would be what LA Metro's talked about, particularly when it comes to using congestion pricing as a way to pay for some level of fare-free transit. That's the innovation that if they can bring that about would be something for the rest of the country to follow. Congestion pricing, of course, can deal with a lot of the issues around the supply of highway and street space, but also deal with the revenues that transit needs. And by making transit fare free, you can actually increase ridership because there is a relationship between fares and ridership. So for those communities that have climate goals and reduction of CO2, that would be one way of doing it. But mostly smaller agencies now, some larger agencies talking about it. It's still very early, but I think there'll be some learning from the experience of trying it now during this crisis that can inform how they might go about doing it.
Thanks for that. One other question that just came in for both of you, perhaps, is what kind of short and long-term impacts can state expect in the bond markets and for debt services? I'm not sure if either of you want to take a swing at that one. I know it might be, again, hard to say at this point, but welcome any thoughts.
Yeah, I can try to address that. We've certainly been thinking about that and trying to put a little bit of attention to it. I think, again, yes, so a lot of states have debt service for transportation projects. I think the most important thing in the short term might be making sure that there is revenue in place to essentially be able to put state dollars towards some of that debt service. So again, if we have this situation where we're having some depletion of both federal and state revenue, if we can get an infusion of federal funds, that might free up the ability to move some of those state dollars more to debt service. I think in large part, we need to try to avoid a situation where programs are kind of cratering and try to keep things at a baseline level. And so when you have revenue coming in from both the federal and state side, you can be a little bit more flexible with how you might meet some of those debt service needs. But that's certainly something that is of interest to AASHTO, and I want to give a little bit more attention to because again, I think the over the long tail probably of recovery from this recession, there could be a lot of impacts when it comes to things like debt service. I will say also that there's probably interest in doing using potentially a future stimulus to do things like raise the cap on private activity bonds, bring back Build America bonds, some of those tools that might be helpful for states in the long term. So I have heard some talk about that.
Yeah, there are 4 transit agencies which there's been a what do you call it, kind of an early kind of alert, if you will, that there could be some issues with bond ratings because of the vulnerabilities associated with sales tax revenue. During the last recession, we saw several transit agencies get downgraded in their bond ratings. we'll see what impact the stimulus has in preventing some of those downward pressures. But we do know that they exist because sales tax is one of those revenue sources that a lot of transit agencies are very dependent upon. And when there's been a sharp decrease in sales tax revenue, you see downgraded bond ratings. And I won't call them out on the call, but there are several already that are facing that pressure.
Right, makes sense. One other question for you, Darnell, that came in specifically on limiting the number of people in a bus or within shuttles so that there's more physical space between passengers. Can you talk a little bit about some of the approaches that you've seen systems taking?
There has been some of that. Several agencies, we've seen them actually deal with spacing. They'll make sure that they suggest to passengers that they keep, the 6 foot away from each other if possible. There's also been some changes in service provision that would help that process along. Plus, in some cities, they've talked about only people who actually need to travel should travel. So both on the supply side of how do we make sure we maintain proper spacing amongst people, but also in attempts to reduce the demand side and having people ride unnecessarily. There's been some discussion of that in some communities as well. So you see both approaches.
Sorry, Darnell, I think you cut out a little bit there for me, but hopefully the rest of the attendees caught that.
Am I still on? Hello? Hello? Hello?
I can hear you.
Oh, you can? Okay. Did we lose Jake?
No, I can't hear Jake.
I'm going to check in with Jake and make sure he's still in. One moment, please.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. This is Jake back in. Can everyone hear me still?
Yes.
Great. Sorry about that. Darnell, were you in the middle of answering a question that I probably rudely interrupted you in the middle of?
I'm not sure if the rest of the group heard it, but essentially I said there are some systems around the country that are encouraged, well, everyone's encouraging people to maintain proper distancing. You also see some configurations of service that can help maintain proper distancing. And you also see some agencies that are attempting to encourage people who don't need to travel not to travel. So sort of echoing stay-at-home orders or orders that you should only travel for the basic essentials or for essential work.
Great, thanks for that. Again, apologies everyone for a little hiccup there. On the 30% loss of revenue, one question is if that amounts to 16 billion. I'm not sure if I followed the exact numbers on that, Susan. And then a question if how much that reduction is a result of diesel versus gasoline decreases.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yeah, let me clarify. The 16.7 billion figure that I cited earlier is actually 10%. That would be a 10% revenue drop. That was actually sort of initial estimate in the very beginning days of really the kind of widespread social distancing and stay at home. Since then, I think we've kind of been told that number is probably a little conservative, and so when I was talking about the 30%, that gets you more into the 48 to 50-ish billion range. And then the other question, I forgot already. I'm sorry.
No, that's totally okay. If how much of that 30%, if there's any split out between diesel and gasoline or
yes.
Any projections there?
Yes, I think the vast majority of that is going to be personal vehicle gasoline. Trucks are still running, maybe not entirely. And again, we don't have good data yet to see this. Our data lags a bit when it comes to both freight truck and passenger vehicle VMT. But I think that there's enough goods movement still happening that we won't see as dramatic of a drop off. I guess I can't say that there won't be some drop off, but this is really, I think, largely just in the same way that the majority of the receipts that come into the federal, the Highway Trust Fund are from personal vehicle use gasoline tax. I think the same will hold for the drop off, and we'll see it mostly in passenger vehicles.
Thanks for that. One question that has come up is on safety. So Darnell mentioned a little bit about safety precautions that are being taken in transit systems to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. There's also been reports of increased bicycle usage, as well as increased bike crashes, at least in New York City. Are there any thoughts being put towards how to increase safety both during this pandemic for all users of the road, as well as any thoughts that transit systems and agencies should be thinking about for an eventual post-coronavirus world?
Well, I would say I think this crisis is making clear the cleavages in our society, the issues with our built environment, is showing all those weaknesses. So going forward, we do need to make sure we maintain the ability for all users to use our mobility system in a safe way, which benefits transit because the better networks you have for alternatives like walking and biking actually enhances transit ridership and makes transit more effective in a community. So I think a lot of this crisis has laid bare a lot of those issues, and we'll have to be cognizant of addressing that for safety and security going forward.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I would agree with everything that Daryl said. I think that certainly for state DOTs, the safety of the people that use our road network is of utmost importance. And this challenge is gonna, I think, probably bear out some lessons. Again, I think we've been really focused on helping the users of our system stay safe in this crisis, and a lot of that has been focused more on the transmission of COVID-19. But I think it's a good question, the overall lessons that can be learned from this type of sort of really unprecedented shift in our nation's sort of behavior and movement. So I think some of that is probably going to bear out over the coming weeks and probably months and years. So yeah, I haven't seen any good data quite yet about vehicle fatalities and bicycle PED. Makes a lot of sense what you're saying about in some metro areas there being a lot of increased ridership for bicycle and pedestrian users. And so we may see that may translate to some new safety data and challenges that we hadn't anticipated.
Thanks for that. One last question on the construction front. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about some of the differences we're seeing between transit agencies and state DOTs on how they're approaching current construction season. I know you mentioned that's at least 2 states and others are considering halting construction on projects in order to prioritize medical related construction. Others are perhaps undergoing more projects as the roads are a little bit more clear at this point, and the projects need to get done regardless. I don't know if either of you have more thoughts you'd like to touch on there.
Sure. Right. So there have been 2 states thus far that have suspended construction, and it really has been based on concern over safety of the contractors and workers on those projects. And we may see more of that it's not entirely clear. Most of our states have been trying to continue construction on critical projects that where that, you know, appropriate and safe distancing can occur. You're right. I mean, the fact that in some areas there may be dramatically reduced vehicle traffic may in fact mean that some of these projects can get, you know, kind of get done quicker or safer, you know. But again, it's certainly a paradigm shift in terms of making sure that the workforce themselves are able to effectively work. I don't know, in terms of the construction season, a lot of our cold weather states, the construction season really doesn't kick in until April. And I don't know yet if some of this may mean that there are some delays. I'll say this, that all of our state DOTs are kind of having to be innovative and on the cutting edge I guess I would say when it comes to technology, because there's a lot of things that are done in person. Public hearings are a perfect example. When you're going through the process for getting a project off the ground and you do the public input period, that's something that can't happen in person now. So working with partners at Federal Highway Administration to get approval to do those virtually, you know, all the different steps that require a lot of different moving pieces have to now be done through a different type of lens. And so I think those are the kinds of institutional changes and shifts that may end up having impacts on just the way that we are delivering projects. But again, I think there's as much fortitude as can be mustered in trying to keep things going, because we understand that we're an industry that for whom people depend on jobs. If we can do it safely and meet the guidelines, we want to try to keep those projects moving as much as we can. And many of them may shift to be to different stages or, you know, working within what we're able to do given the public health and public safety concerns.
So on the transit side, I've definitely seen reports of agencies continuing to work where possible and where safe on their state-of-good repair issues. As you know, state-of-good repair remains a major issue for public transportation systems with a $99 billion backlog. So some of them are using this opportunity in time where there might be reduced service or reduced ridership to continue to work on those issues where possible.
Great, thank you both. And thank you everyone for joining this webinar. Thank you to our speakers for their generously giving their time to talk about these issues. As a reminder, the slides and the recording of this webinar will be posted on nga.org. NGA, the National Government Association, is also tracking all state activity as regards to the coronavirus, and that's being continually updated with resources and following all executive orders and legislation that comes out at nga.org/coronavirus. If you have any questions, it's a great resource to check out. Thank you all again for joining us, and we will be providing more information on these topics and other transportation issues to our learning network of Governor's Transportation Policy Advisors. Thank you again.